This is about the laws of Shabbos, the Mishnah Brura. So I'm gonna try my best. So just gonna go through the intro.
Okay.
And intro's got yeah. Is what Arthur, you there? Okay.
You'll probably have to break it up, Kevin. It's gonna be you'll have to break it into small chunks because it's probably gonna be quite lengthy otherwise.
Yeah, sure. No, let's just go through the intro here. Okay. So it says in Shmot, as we are now, funnily enough, remember the Shabbos day to sanctify it. 6 days shall you work, but the 7th day is Shabbos to Hashem your God. You shall do no work. For in the 6 days Hashem made the heaven and the earth, and he rested on the 7th day. It says this verse teaches us how Shabbos is the very root of our faith, of our belief in the creation of the world. Since Hashem created everything, he is our master of everything. And we are his servants who must obey him and serve him with our entire bodies, souls, and possessions, since everything is his. The Torah warns us 12 times to observe Shabbos. Our sages say that a person who observes Shabbos is considered to have observed the entire Torah. But a person who desecrates the Shabbos is considered to have rejected the entire Torah. The reason for this is that Shabbos is the very root of our faith, as we explained above. And just two more things here. Midrash Rabbah states in Parashas Beshalach, which we also read recently, Rav Elazar ben Avina said, we find in the Torah, in the Nevi'im and in the Ketuvim, that Shabbos is equal to all the mitzvahs. In the Torah, when Moshe delayed informing the children of Israel about the mitzvah Shabbos, Hashem said to him, also in Shmot, until when you refuse to observe my Torah, my commandments. It then states, behold, Hashem has given you the Shabbos. Okay, let's leave it at that because we're short for time. Okay, that's okay.
Okay.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kevin.
All right. So look, we'll keep. I've studied a lot of the notes of the stuff, and it gets overly complicated. So what I'm going to do, if you'd allow me some poetic license, is to actually oversimplify it, because otherwise it can drive you a little bit scatty. If you at Rabbi Cohen's level, who is like an Olympian athlete, compared to somebody that's a good local soccer player at the local club, that's the difference between me and Rabbi Cohen. I think I know what my limits are, and I know that we can analyze this thing for weeks, this generalization thing. I just want to fly through it so we can get to some more easier stuff and just give you the bottom line outplay, if you don't mind. I just thought I'd be doing you a favor because you don't want to hear me drone on. I barely want to hear me drone on. So, I mean, where did we end off last? We were talking about as you know, there was a case where it set the foundation because it said, look, there's two different brises. Okay, the one brisa says that the pasuk 8 and 9. The first pasuk is dealing with the custodian who made a claim of theft and was caught out lying by witnesses. And the second pasuk is the same theme. And there's a second brisa that says the first pasuk is about an actual thief, and the second brisa is about a custodian who claimed a claim of theft and was caught lying by witnesses. So we then said, well, okay, according to we had this issue, is that everything was well if you're speaking about a thief, and then a second verse you're talking about a custodian who makes a false claim of theft. But then if you're taking the brisa and both verses are speaking about a claim of theft by a thief, we basically said, well, how do we know that an actual thief pays a twofold payment for objects that, for example, are not inanimate objects? That was the verse that Kevin read from Shmot 22, verse 3. And we said, look, maybe you can derive it from a kol v'chomer. And the only problem is the dayu, because the kol v'chomer said that we learn that if a custodian makes a claim of theft and he was caught lying, he pays a twofold payment. And therefore, even more so, somebody that never had permission to have the article, if he breaks the law, is even more of a rogue than somebody that initially had permission. For sure, in that case, he makes a twofold payment. But the problem is the original law of the custodian is he only makes a twofold payment if he made an oath prior or said amen to an oath. And therefore, we learn that we can't apply in the target area a more stringent principle than in the source area. So we say here, then a thief would also have to take an oath. And then Gavin quite rightly said, but that seems a bit weird because we know a thief's a rogue. You're not going to believe him anyway. I mean, so we've got to know it's more to it than that he's got to pay the twofold payment. You can learn it from. But what do you do with this principle of the dayu that seeks to limit the application from the source to the target of an actual thief that he has to take an oath? So we have to learn in a separate pasuk about the thief's twofold payment without an oath. And then we learn in the Academy of Chizkiah that there was that next part of that article of the Chumash on verse 7 and 8, it says, basically, if a man steals an ox or a sheep, if being found, will it be found, the stolen article in his possession, whether an ox, a donkey, or sheep, live, he shall pay twofold. So we're saying, okay, so that's a definite indication that he shall pay twofold for an inanimate object, because we know it mentions the word stolen article, and stolen isn't specific to moving. But then some questions have come up. Now, what questions have come up? We said, okay, so then why do you have to mention this whole wording where it's an entourage of animals and then a living animal, and if it being found, will it be found, and a stolen article? Why don't we just learn the term ox and stolen article? And if you learn those both, then everything can be included, okay? And what do we mean in everything that could be included? What is an ox as a general principle? Because again, we're moving, if we say an ox and then we're talking about a stolen item, it expands the specific to a much more general term. Stolen in that case could be animate and inanimate objects, but as far as the animal is concerned, you could say that all items, just like an animal moves, all items that are movable you pay for, including garments, anything that is not fixed, like land, that is not actually able to be stolen itself. Slaves, because they have the legal status of land, and documents that don't have intrinsic value. It's the contents of the document that have value. So an animal has intrinsic value. So in other words, this is teaching you that surely everything is covered that's movable and has intrinsic value. Now, there's a question, is because if you'd have written that, you can't determine that that would be the case, because it means how general do you go and how specific do you go? In other words, if you're going quite specific, fine, movable and have intrinsic value if you're looking at the ox. But again, the minute you go to a generalization of stolen article, it could be pretty much everything, because of the homeostatic principle that if you go from specific to general, the specific is mainly ignored. So it was saying, surely you could have just written ox and stolen article and everything would be included. So the Brisa answers, had it been written so, I would say that just as the specified item is specifically an animal that can be offered on the Mizbeach, on the altar, so to any animal that can be offered on the altar is included. Okay? Now, then there is a problem. Now, the problem is that in the very next verse, it mentions the word sheep. So in other words, say you had a whole list of items apart from an ox that would qualify as being offerable on the altar, then I would say that ox could form that prototype. But the problem is the only other animal that can be, literally, is sheep or goat. The reason why you wouldn't say a dove per se is because remember that birds don't convey tumor in their carcass, so they're not intrinsically the same as animals that convey tumor in their carcass. So it would have to be, to a certain degree, more similar. just because it's a dove doesn't mean it's similar. It is in the fact that it's in a mizbeach, but it's not in the fact that it doesn't have intrinsic tumah about touching or carrying. So the only other animal left is a sheep. So the problem is, it's fine if you want to say ox because it's now narrowing the playing field when you're just talking about the animals, because the proposal is, okay, if you're talking about animals, we have to have animals similar to ox. And maybe if you're talking about stolen items, you're talking about everything else. In other words, inanimate objects, animals that are not things that are not living. So if you stole garden shears, you'd pay back twice. Whereas if you're talking about an animal, well, it could only be an animal that is similar to an ox, because ox is a specificity. And therefore, what other animal is an animal that can be offered in the Mizbeach? So what's the only other animal? Sheep and goat. Or sheep. So the thing of it is, the problem is the pasuk then mentions the word sheep. So now the Gemara's got a question, or the Bryce, it's saying, hang on a second. You've just mentioned ox, and then you mentioned sheep. So if you've mentioned ox and you've mentioned sheep, like, kind of what's the point? You've listed these two items, and are you telling me that's the only thing that, in fact, there's a twofold payment? So number one, the problem is that if it's stating a prototype and it's saying everything within this category needs to be covered double, there's a purpose for stating that prototype, because it's giving you a category. But the minute it mentions sheep, it's removed everything from that category, and now you know it's only those two animals. So then you don't have to bother to really say that, because you've got two problems. The first problem, as Gavin pointed out the other day, is that it doesn't talk about the twofold payment. Kevin actually pointed this out. Sorry, Gavin, you came out afterwards, but Kevin was the fastest gun in the West on that day. And he turned around and said that an ox is a fivefold payment and a sheep is a fourfold payment. So, how's that covered for that pasuk, when that pasuk clearly says, if a man steals an ox or a sheep, if being found, will it be found, the stolen article in his possession, whether an ox, a donkey, or a sheep, live, he shall pay twofold. In other words, if you're saying your specificity is only an ox or a sheep, we know already there you don't pay twofold, do you? Kevin pointed this out. The Chumash says so, but we learn, as Rav Chia Bar Abba said in the name of Rav Yochanan, whether it's living or sold or slaughtered, you pay a fourfold and fivefold respectively. So therefore, there's two problems the Bryce is bringing up. Firstly, when you mention something so specific, and then there's only one other item in that category, and then the Chumash mentions it at the next word, you can't just be dealing about those two items, because then why bring it up as a category of twofold? Neither in a category of twofold. And secondly, you've eliminated that whole category if the next word is included the maximum that is animal that is in that category. Okay? So, guys, you can read this yourself, and you'll see that I'm getting through a lot of detail here, believe it or not. So, basically, when the Torah states sheep, you have sheep stated explicitly. So then you've got a problem, because the generalization specification combination indicated by the expression stolen article isn't needed to teach us to include sheep. Why? Because you can't say that when the Torah stated the expression stolen article. And it's done there because it's part of the humanatic principle that says when you've got a generalization and a specification combination, its intent is to include only such animals that are similar to the specification, in that they are fit to be offered in the altar. Because all the animals that would teach us, only sheep and goats, already stated explicitly in the verse, and we would know to apply the twofold payment to them, even without the generalization and specification combination. That's what Rashi is saying. And then further to which we've noticed, Kevin and I, there's not a twofold for those animals. It's actually fourfold and fivefold. Okay. So again, the other issue that you have is that you're only talking about animals on the Mizbeach. So accordingly, how do I account for the generalization stolen article? Okay. In other words, how must I expound this principle of generalization, specification, combination formed by a stolen article, which it's now coming to expand the verses law to include things that are not stated explicitly in the specification, but are similar to it. So Rashi is saying that that combination is there to show you not only that specific category, but a similar category. That's what it's there to show you. Okay? So accordingly, how do I account for the generalization stolen article? Because it must be meant to include all things that are similar to an ox in that they are movable and have intrinsic value. And that's why it's explained why the Torah had to write sheep. Okay? Because in other words, if you've mentioned just ox and sheep, the word sheep is redundant. If I'm trying to talk to you about only things that are offered in the altar, then I'm not mentioning sheep because sheep is obvious. That's what the Bryce is saying. You don't mention the obvious if you specialize the category to that degree. The very fact that you added sheep is coming to teach you now to broaden your explanation. And that broadened explanation is animals that are, other creatures that mimic a sheep and an ox in that they're movable and have intrinsic value. So that's why the Torah had to write sheep. Now the Bryce is going to ask another question. It says, okay, so let the Torah write only sheep, ox, and stolen article, and everything else would be included. Why must the Torah mention donkey as well? Now, I'm going to give you guys a chance to guess. I'm sure you know. This is Chazorah.
So the donkey is because the donkey is not offered up on the altar. But there's a thing with the Bechor or something. I can't remember, something like that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
It's redeemed.
Correct. So a donkey, although it's not a kosher animal, is the only other animal that is got some degree of sanctification in its process. In other words, you have to redeem it, but you can't have benefit. Because it's the firstborn, it has to go to the Most High. So its neck is broken, and I think a kosher animal is offered to a Kohen in lieu of that, a donkey, etc. So the problem is now you might say that when you're looking at donkey added, you've got an issue because if the Torah states donkey, you've stated it explicitly, okay? And then the generalization specification combination indicated by the expression stolen article is not needed to teach us donkey. Okay. So what does this mean? Is that if you have donkey, ox, and sheep, you know these are all the categories of consecration of the firstborn. Now, if you put in the word donkey, you've got a problem because you've taken out every guess of the category. So it's now, then why would you need the word donkey necessarily? That's what it's asking. Because, in other words, guys, if it's stated explicitly in the verse, you would know to apply the twofold payment to them, even without that generalization specification combination according to donkey. So the thing of it is that donkey, if I say these are the categories, and it's about consecration on the firstborn, and then I throw in the word donkey, I've stated the obvious. Why would I throw in the word donkey? It's repeating the same principle. So the Bryce is saying that's a problem. You're giving a principle, then you're throwing in something that's obvious in that principle. So it's not coming to teach you anything new because donkey is obvious. So it means that the adding of donkey is not trying to teach you about consecration of the firstborn. It's trying to teach you to expand it one level above that. So accordingly, the Gemara says, how do I account for the generalization stolen article? It must be meant to include all things that are similar to an ox, in that they are movable and have intrinsic value. And that's why it explained that the Torah had to write donkey as well. So let me just put it in a simple word, is that basically donkey is added not to show you the obvious, but to show you to expand it. Because if it's just going to be in subcategories in terms of consecration of the firstborn, and it's mentioned every animal, there's no need to mention it in the Chumash, because that would be the extent. So That's the problem. So then the Bryson now asks on the next word the same thing. Let this Torah state only ox, donkey, sheep, and stolen article, because you've expanded now ox, donkey, and sheep to include everything that's movable and has intrinsic value. And you add the word starting stolen article, and then guys, what have you included? If I add in stolen article, inanimate objects.
Inanimate objects.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in other words, what would happen is maybe you could say if it's animate objects or living objects, you're including things that convey tumor in their carcass, that broad. And stolen articles, things that are not living, like movable articles or inanimate objects like clothing. And it says if you mention those statements, ox, donkey, sheep, and stolen article, everything would be included. Why do you have to mention the word live as well? In other words, the word live gives the inclusion of all living things. And you can also work this out by the word ox, donkey, and sheep, because they're living. So why would you need the word live? It's not seeming to add anything of value, because we haven't got so far generalization, specification, generalization combination. We've got the third humanistic principle, which is just generalization, specification. So what that means is it's only teaching you about articles that are movable and has intrinsic value. And why did the Torah have to state live to teach us to include every living thing? That's what Rashi is saying. So does it mean that when it mentions a stolen article, it's talking about inanimate objects, or does the stolen article also mean living, but not within those categories of animals? So it could mean something else. It could mean yeah, just hang on.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to
just want to say something. It could specifically mention live because their animals don't have any intrinsic value.
Not at all true. Not at all true.
Okay, I'm just asking. I
think that's an excellent question. They don't have any. A dead animal doesn't have any charismatic value. In other words,
that's what I'm saying. Like once it's gone, it's value of the meat, but it has no.
But that's exactly. I think Arthur brought up a good point. But
looking for
let me put you on mute, Arthur. Well, I don't want to put you on mute. Just
I don't need it. Why? Okay, I'll put myself on mute.
Okay, so Arthur brought up a good point, is that if you have a family pet, you might think that once it's dead, you're not going to eat your dog because it's treif. The only reason you kept it around was for its value of its personality. But it's only in middle class or upper class 20th century that people started keeping animals for amusement. Before then, animals were food. That's all they were. They were transport, they were food, they were utilities. That's all they were. So therefore, the intrinsic value was twofold. While alive, the intrinsic value was what? Transport, or the ability to move things or to ride them. When they're dead, the intrinsic value is meat, but that's still intrinsic value. The Gemara's definition of intrinsic value is saying, look, when you've got a promissory note, you want it for the concept of what that document contains, but not for the intrinsic value of the paper. So documents are not twofold payments. Documents are not twofold payments. A good question Arthur asked the other day is currency considered if you steal 100 shekels that you have to pay 200 back because money is objectively valuable, he was saying, because currencies are recognized? Or is it still considered intrinsic value, that the paper's itself not worth anything, but merely the concept that you attach to it? And Arthur's question was good with money. This one wasn't relevant, but the other one was good. And no, it wasn't, because we don't see animals today the same way as we did. If we did, Arthur would be 100% correct. Animals were just food and transport. But the question remains that Arthur did touch on is maybe that we learn there that when it mentions live, it's saying that an animal you only have to pay a twofold payment when an animal is alive. But if you slaughtered the animal, do you have to pay the fourfold and fivefold payment back? That is a question that is asked in the commentaries. And the reality is we learned from Rav Chia Bar Abba, who said in the name of Rav Yochanan, that according to that opinion, it said if you sell it or slaughter it, you pay the fourfold or fivefold. Okay? And he bases it on Shmot, chapter 21, verse 37. Okay. So, what we do learn here is something interesting. We learn that if you look at ox and sheep, there's no ways you learn the twofold payment from ox and sheep, as Kevin quite rightly mentioned. The only one you learn it from is which animal guys mentioned? The three animals.
For what?
Donkey, exactly. Kevin's
donkey, yeah. Sorry, I didn't actually hear that one part.
Sorry. Kevin, well done. So donkey is the only thing that we learned about the twofold payment. So from there, it could be saying that for all other living animals, apart from the ox and the sheep, we learn about the twofold payment. So the Gemara is asking, why is the word lav mentioned as well? So the Brisa answered, had it been written so that I would say, just as the specification is specifically living things, so too all living things are included. Okay? In other words, the Torah's mention of ox, donkey, and sheep in the specification forces us to expand the law of twofold payment beyond animals that are subject to consecration of the firstborn. Because when it mentions donkey, you don't mention there's a category and then mention the only animal because it's redundant. It's no good repeating the same concept. It doesn't teach you anything. The Torah doesn't waste word. So it's teaching you then to expand the category by 1 degree, and that would include only items that, although not subject to consecration of the firstborn, are most similar to the specification in that they too are living. So by specifying lav, the Torah teaches that the generalization, specification combination indicated by the expression stolen article doesn't mean to teach us to include only things that are similar to the specification ox, and that they're living things. Because we already know the twofold payment applies to all living things from the word lav stated explicitly in the verse. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? So then,
no.
The Brisa, so then it says, why must the Torah mention lav as well? Because had it been written, so I would say, just as the specification is specifically living things, so too all living things are included. Now, what would you have this include? Only other living things. But when the Torah states the word lav, you have other living things stated explicitly. Okay? So accordingly, how do I account for the generalization stolen article? In other words, firstly, you're talking about things that are living. Then what do you need the term stolen article for? Because it's meant to include all things that are similar to an ox, that they're movable and have intrinsic value. So now we're suddenly saying, guys, they needn't be similar in respect to being live creatures. They can mimic the category of specificity in the fact that stolen article is saying, like, listen, you have a category of living articles that you pay for, and you also have a category of inanimate objects that are still movable as opposed to land and have intrinsic value. The stolen article tells us that you still have to pay double for non-living items. Okay? So that explains that. So the Brisa of Chizkiah's Academy details the source of the scope of the twofold payment in the case of an actual thief. So we needed that because there's the Brisa that holds, that first Brisa that holds that the 7th and 8th verse in the Pasuk just speaks about a custodian who was caught lying about a claim of theft. So if you analyze this Brisa from Chizkiah's Academy, the master said in the Brisa, let the Torah state only oxen, stolen article, and everything would be included. But it says, if you look at the Chumash carefully, it doesn't use the word ox and stolen article, because then you're going from where? Is ox specific or general, guys?
It's specific.
Good. And stolen article?
It's general.
So what happens when you go from a specific to a general in terms of principal application? What happens?
When you go, it's still narrowed. It's broadening it, but it's still based on the specification, though.
Not really. It's only when you've got a generalization, specification, generalization, but not when you've got a specification, generalization. That's the
Okay,
problem.
I didn't know that. Okay.
So, because there are 5 homeonetic principles, there's 3, 4, and 5. So there's 3 and 4, and the one states if you go from specific to general, if I say, Ruvain, here's some chocolate. Class, here's some chocolate. Now it's no longer just Ruvain, it's the whole class. But if I say specific, Ruvain, class, and then the boys, I've now Gavin's completely right. When you've got generalization, specification, generalization, you're not open for an open generalization to every extent, but still constrained somewhat from the specification to a degree, but not when you've got a specification generalization. Okay, now this is the issue at hand, is that we so far been learning, okay, ox is mentioned, and then the word stolen article, which means you're getting specific, and then you're getting broad again. Because the question that the Brycer kept asking, what if you mention ox? Guys, Kevin, this is very important. The Brycer is saying, what if you mention ox in stolen article? You would have included everything, both living and inanimate, and movable, intrinsic value, everything. Because you're specific in general. You've covered the whole gambit, okay? So the problem is that the Chumash doesn't mention it in the order. Listen to how the Chumash actually does mention it. It says, and the Gemara is bringing it up now, that the Brycer is bringing it up in the wrong order, because it says in the Chumash, if a man steals an ox or a sheep, and that's the first pasuk, but it goes on to say, if being found, will it be found? The stolen article in his possession, whether an ox, a donkey, or a sheep, he shall pay twofold. So it actually starts with the word, if being found, will it be found? The stolen article in his possession, whether an ox, a donkey, or a sheep, live, he shall pay twofold. So it's saying, when it starts off with that verse, if a man shall steal an ox or a sheep, you don't carry on with the word the stolen article to expand it, because the word if being found, will it be found, separates the two. So you have to take the stolen article in his possession first, and then take the rest of that pasuk, which says whether it be an ox, a donkey, or sheep, live, shall pay twofold. So it says up until now, we've had this understanding that you learn specific, then general, and you can include all things. But now it's mentioning general, stolen article, and then it mentions ox, specific, which means we learn from there that when you go from general to specific, it funnels, and then it doesn't expand anything further than the specific. Because if I say, guys, I'm giving you all 100 shekels. Kevin, here's 100 shekels. So Kevin would be the only one to get 100 shekels, because now I've gone from saying a general principle to funnel it to a very specific person. So that Brycer doesn't work with the way the pasuk comes out. So that's what it's actually bringing here, that it says, the master said in the Brycer, analyzing the Brycer of Chizkiah's Academy, let the Torah state only oxen, stolen article, and everything would be included. But is oxen, stolen article what is written? Why? It's the other way around. Stolen article and ox is what is written. And perhaps you will say that the Tana is saying, had it been stated, okay? In other words, had it stated the generalization stolen article first and the specification ox or donkey, sheep afterwards. Let the Torah state a specification first and the generalization afterwards, thereby forming a specification generalization sequence, for the Torah could then teach us to include all items, and there'd be no need for the Torah to mention anything else. But the problem is it doesn't mention it like that. It mentions general first and then specific. So then you'd have to say, well, then the question reasserts itself. If you just mention ox, we learn that only animals that can be offered in the altar are included to the exclusion of others. When you then add in the word sheep, you know that ox and sheep are the only one consecrated, so why mention sheep? It's to expand it, that specificity by 1 degree, to say that basically all animals that apart from being consecrated, that are living, and then the minute you that are also consecrated as firstborn. But the problem is then you mention the word donkey, and then donkey is saying, but then you've just stated it twice. So donkey is then going to expand the specificity to a point where everything that is movable and has intrinsic value would be included. And the word live then is saying, no, hang on a second, you've got only living creatures. Okay, and then a question is arising. Then if you're only talking about living creatures, then how would you be able to include everything that is movable and has intrinsic value, similar to the specification of an ox? The word living creatures kind of throws it off. So that's what we're going to be dealing with next time. Okay. So guys, I think it sounds reasonable so far. And then we're going to learn what Rava says.